I think we got sucked through a portal of some sort. That was amazing. We're all still here, right? Got a good crowd. This is my first Stir Trek. First time. I've spoken at a lot of conferences, but never in a movie theater. It's weird to see a movie theater from the wrong side. I feel like I should be telling you there's a tornado outside. It's the only time somebody's spoken to me. I'm from Kansas, so in Kansas, that happens. I've been to a movie theater twice where we had to leave the theater during a tornado, so this is cool. So I can't tell from up here, but is it echoey? Okay. He shakes his head. It's like, yeah, it is what it is. Okay, that's what I figured. I mean, the only idea that I have is you could still mic me, but you could turn off the speakers and I could just speak up in here and my mic would go to other people. But I don't know if that's better. Not possible? Well, that's definitely not better then. We're going to rule that one out. Okay, so we got like 3 minutes, right? And I want to confirm we're in here till 10:15. We got 45 minutes of fun ahead. All right, so I like to get to know the crowd beforehand. Who in here is writing automated tests consistently? Okay, so I got a lot of people that aren't doing that today or don't feel like raising their hands on a Friday. It's, we'll make it the weekend early. Who in here is using LLMs to generate their automated tests? Oh, very few people. That was maybe 5% of the room. I'm not surprised that you raised your hand, Steve. Yeah. Is anyone in here, do they have a title? This talk is not all about LLMs and AI. There's just a little slice of it that is, but I'm just curious. Who in here has a title that is related to AI? I know Steve does. Like, I know 3 or 4 people now whose title is just like Chief Principal AI Executive Know-It-All, something like that. It's weird. Like, we have new titles now for this stuff. Like, it's of interest to me. Okay, so before we start, I'll also say, I'm from Kansas City. I've been doing software development since the late 90s. So I've seen a lot of things come and go. And this talk is titled Lessons from 10 Years, even though I've been coding for a lot longer than that. And that's partially because a good portion of my career, I was like a lot of people in here, and I wasn't writing automated tests. So I'm just being very candid with you all that I truly didn't think they were worthwhile. How many of you think tests are a waste of time? Just be totally honest. Or at least they've seen them be a waste of time. Okay. But I don't think y'all are being honest, frankly. Or maybe you've got raise hand fatigue now. I've seen that. We've been there. Okay, it is 9:29. You got 1 minute. Anybody have a question for me before we start?
Are you only going to talk about unit testing?
Am I only going to talk about unit testing? No. In fact, that is part of the conversation is, what the heck do you define as unit testing at all? That is one of the biggest problems in automated testing itself is vernacular. People don't agree what words mean, and it's really screwing things up, and it makes it very hard for us to have conversations with each other. So that's one of the problems that I want to address in here. The other thing is, once you get started, well, just in my experience, one of the hardest parts is just getting momentum. So we'll talk about that too. Okay, so I've delayed. I wanted to wait until exactly 9:30 to actually get rolling because I know they're simulcasting and people are probably funneling into other rooms. But let's begin. Good morning, Stir Trek. Let's talk about automated testing, and I'm going to begin with a confession. I thought tests were a waste of time. I started writing code in the late 90s, and as of 2000, this was my view. And I felt that way because of a number of factors. For one thing, if you were coding back in the year 2000, the tools were bad. The browsers were awful. I was dealing with all sorts of just basic problems. The code that I was writing wasn't friendly to testing. Trying to figure out how to test JavaScript when you were just writing plain old DOM queries or maybe slapping some MooTools and later jQuery and those sorts of things in, it was really nasty. So there were a number of good reasons I felt like this was a justified view. And I'll also recognize that if you're going to critique tests, there's lots of ways that you can move faster. You effectively just turn the quality dial down, skip tests, types, docs, code reviews, and so on. We do this all the time. When your boss says to you, move faster, this is what you do. You don't tell your boss you're going to do all things usually. You just cut a bunch of crap and then move on. And this is a very dangerous place to be. This isn't wrong, though. It is just effectively taking on debt that you're going to have to pay down later. So this tends to slow you down in the longer term. Thus, I encourage you to at least communicate, to let people know the trade-offs you're making if you feel like you're having to cut corners. Now, the claim is often that we don't have time to write tests. I have at least thought this many times before, and I've heard many teams say it. But the reality is tests usually will save you time. They tend to pay for themselves, and I will say this is even more true today than ever before because there's so little time required to write tests, as I'll show in a second. Now, I found some projects fail because the team tried to move too fast. They didn't ask, should we slow down and create some systems? They just start writing code right away. And I'm a consultant, so I will often join a team, and it's frustrating because I'll come in and there's already so many disparate practices and patterns and libraries and debt that's been created when if we just slowed down at the beginning and standardized and codified and created reusable pieces, we'd have been in a better spot. So I suggest starting slow and then moving fast later, and writing tests is part of that. When I have a good test suite, I can change things, and I don't even feel like I have to run the UI. If all the tests pass, I feel very confident that I can ship it. And I've literally been on teams with tests that good, where I just blindly felt comfortable fixing a bug, watching the test pass, and I didn't need to manually run through the app and make sure it worked. So I would encourage you, think long-term, and this can be a real struggle because sometimes management thinks short-term. It's easy to cut corners, and it is also a real struggle if you have a manager who's constantly thinking short-term. This is part of the downside of America and thinking in terms of quarters and trying to raise stock prices in the short term. To become something great, you do need to think long-term. I also am a big fan of tests because tests are documentation. I have found that tests are docs with better ergonomics that stay more updated. They are in line. They're checked on every single build. They must be fresh or the build fails. And they are automatically validated. Every time that I commit, I know my tests are right. Whereas my docs just sit over here in some folder or in some system and they rot. They rust, they decay, they get dusty because they get out of sync with the real world. My code is reality. My docs are, maybe, they might be right, but we don't know. And another thing that we get from optimizing our tests for readability is documentation that is always accurate. That's a huge benefit to tests. I love when somebody opens a pull request and I can read their tests because now their tests document their intent. They tell me what they were expecting. So you could sort of think about it this way. Tests tell it how it is, whereas docs tell it how it might be. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. I'm also authoring a course on advanced TypeScript. I'm publishing on DomeTrain this month. I'm almost done. And I just published a Getting Started one a few weeks ago on the same platform. The reason I'm a big fan of tests, or types in particular, is that types are basically tests, and they're tests with better ergonomics. And by that I mean types provide faster feedback in line with less code than the equivalent test would require. If I want to make sure that I am going to always pass numbers to a function, it's much easier to just put a type annotation in than to write a unit test. And it's less code, it's in line. If I fail to do so, I get immediate feedback. I don't have to run the test suite. Lots of benefits to types. Now, I will say, the risk, I see this a lot. Static language developers, if you're in here and you're writing C#, you might just say, all I need is types. And if you're in here and you write Ruby or Python, you might say, all I need is tests. So people tend to get myopically focused and think, well, my types are so good, I feel pretty darn comfortable the thing compiles. But there was an interesting poll that I put on Twitter just a little while ago. I asked people, if you had to choose between types or tests, which would you choose? This is a false dichotomy. You don't have to choose, but if you had to choose, this was so interesting. Thousands and thousands of people responded on that poll, and it ended up 50-50, almost perfectly 50-50. By just a hair, and I mean a hair, types won. And you could want to pull your hair out and say that that's wrong because types don't prove the dang thing works. Types just prove it compiles, whereas tests actually, in theory, prove that it works. The problem is, you've probably seen this too, what I've found is people tend to do a better job writing types than they do writing tests. I see a lot of teams that do a pretty darn good job declaring types in general. They don't have a whole lot of innies, for instance, in TypeScript. But their tests, on the other hand, in many cases don't even test what they thought they should, or they have huge gaps in their coverage. So I think that's part of why some people lean toward choosing types. So types are tests with, well, all these sorts of things. Types are checking naming, casing, type conversions, mapping between data structures, and so on. Types are testing all these things. So they aren't replacing all my tests, but boy, they're helpful. They reduce the number of tests that I need to write, and they make my tests easier to write and maintain because I can lean on those types as I write my tests. Also, now in the world of LLMs, having types creates more signal for my LLM to generate code for me, which is really cool. And it also helps me see right away when the LLM screwed up and the code won't even compile because it didn't honor some type somewhere. So you fast forward, here it is, 2025. I think tests are probably worth it. Now I did put the word probably in here. I'm hedging a little bit because only a Sith speaks in absolutes. But let me talk about why I darn near took the word probably out. And the reason I say that is just a few weeks ago, actually I guess it was just last week, I did a webinar on generating automated tests using AI. And I would encourage you to generate tests using an LLM. Now, if we had internet, I would actually go through a live demo here, but I didn't want to assume that would exist, so I'm going to show you static pages instead. This was my prompt. I went to Copilot and I said, generate unit tests for contact.tsx. That is a React component, and if I ran it, you could imagine what it looks like. It's a contact form, it has a username, it has a password. If I don't enter username or password, it validates, it puts in red lines and tells me what fields I didn't enter. So I told it to generate a unit test. This is the code that it generated. Now you can see the scroll bar. It's only a portion of the code that it generated, but it generated around 60, 70 lines of unit test code for my React component. It did a pretty great job. What was impressive was that's literally all I told it was generate unit tests. I didn't say what library to use, what framework to use, what naming convention. It just did it, and you notice it goes, well, I'll go ahead and use testing library because that's pretty popular, and I can see that you have Vite test down in package.json, so I'll go ahead and use that. It figured out this context, which really impressed me. Now this was especially impressive because the dang thing passed on the very first try. Like I one-shotted a unit test on a React component. So this is a fairly simple, autonomous, pure React component, but quite impressive. And also I will say, this is one of the nice things about using very mainstream technology like React because the LLMs are so darn good at working with it now. So you move forward a bit, and I go, okay, well, what if I want to write tests, say, in Playwright, and I would like Playwright to go automate the browser and move through my application and click around and make sure things work as expected? Well, I go over to Copilot, and I say, generate Playwright tests for the application at this URL. That was my prompt. And what did I get as a result? I got all this. I got hundreds of lines of Playwright test code. And you know what? It didn't pass. But I got hundreds of lines of code, and it was not that far off. I spent probably 2 or 3 minutes fixing a couple things that it got wrong. And this was not perfect, though. This was, in fact, far from perfect as I started to look at it, because first I look at it and I go, oh, I got a lump in my throat. This is too good. This is like scared I'm losing my job good. I don't know if you guys ever feel that when you're interacting with a LLM that surprises you with its fidelity. But I would point out here, this is not perfect. So for instance, you could look up there, look at line 11. It's doing an unaccessible locator. It's looking for something using a CSS selector, which is not attractive. It's not attractive because it's brittle. If the CSS changes, I don't want my test locator to fail. And also, this doesn't encourage me writing accessible HTML. I would like to use better selectors. So, also, I have no idea whether this actually hit all the requirements. So I have a few ideas for how I could make this better. So the next thing I do, I go over to ChatGPT, and I tell ChatGPT, given the application at this URL, write a requirements document for me and generate it into Markdown. So ChatGPT generates hundreds of lines of requirements by going out to the URL that I sent it to and just spitting out a Markdown file. I take that Markdown file, I save it into my project, and now I can point my LLM at the requirements. And also, here's the nice thing. We're learning this more and more, that LLMs work better when we work through things in steps. When we say, I want you to tell me what you're going to do before you do it, because now I can see your thinking process, and I can tell you, don't do this, you can do this easier. So before it's executed, I can improve its execution. And this thinking deeply tends to really help with the output here. So I took this, and what's really cool is, after doing this, after creating this prompt, I generated tests again, and the tests were longer. They were covering more cases because now it was using that requirements file to make sure it covered all the cases. Super cool. Is anybody doing this yet? One person, two people. Okay, there we go, Steve. We'll get three. So I have a prediction that this is going to become the norm because I just don't see why not. It's so cheap. Once I did it, I thought, well, this feels pretty obvious to me. I just really like the setup. That said, if you already had a requirements document, I wouldn't necessarily go tell an LLM to generate it, but in my experience, often we don't have a centralized requirements doc. We have lots of tickets all over the place. So the next thing you can do to make your tests even better, create an instruction file for your LLM. So for example, here I'm working with GitHub Copilot. I created copilotinstructions.md, and this is my way to tell Copilot exactly what my opinions are. Now I want you to pay attention to the code over on the right. Look at what I've told it. I said we use vtest for unit testing. We use testing library for React for testing React components. We extend vtest with these custom mashers. We don't use Fire event. We prefer user event. We have vtest configured to use JS DOM, and on and on and on. So we are giving all this different context. The more context I can give about our opinions, it's sort of like, this is like coding standards for your LLM. Is very much the case. So you think of, I just heard this yesterday and it really stuck. Somebody had said that we should treat an LLM not as magic, but as a coworker. And if you ask a coworker to do something and they do it wrong, you don't just tell them to do it again with the same thing and hope that you get a better response. You say, okay, clearly I didn't give you enough context. So iterate with your LLM. And when it messes up, think, okay, what context did I not give you? And in fact, here's a little tip. You can actually tell the LLM, ask me questions so that I can give you the information that you need. What information could I give you, LLM, so that you have the context you need to write better tests? So that is really cool. You're getting a feedback loop, much like you would if you were talking to a new hire developer. Now, this was not perfect, but after I used this instructions file, I got a much better set of HTML. And in fact, I will draw your attention to, see the const to do. Oh, this is very important. We got to pause for a second because I need a selfie. If you haven't spoken in a, there we go. Yeah, I've never spoke. Oh, wow, this looks really cool from up here. All right, so let's put our hands up like we're at Disney World on a roller coaster. That's just more fun, right? Yeah! Oh, y'all look fantastic. Thank you. All right, so I want to draw your attention to right in the middle on this right-hand side. Notice how it says const to do input equals page.getByPlaceholder. See how much better that is because it is an accessible locator. Now I'm using the terminology that my user would think about when they're interacting with the application. Instead of looking for a CSS class, which a user doesn't care about, or an ID, which again, a user doesn't care about, I'm putting in an accessible locator. So I do want to draw attention to this yellow box here, because the LLM, in this case, had to work around bad HTML, because it can't change the HTML that I pointed it at. So it went in and it had to say, OK, the LI has text, buy groceries. And I want to show you why it had to do this. So here was the application I pointed it at. And the problem is, this application has an accessibility issue. Every one of these radios has the exact same label on it. They're all just labeled as toggle to do. Well, if I'm using a screen reader, that's not good, because it would mean that as I tabbed through the radios, what I would hear is button, toggle to do, button, toggle to do, button, toggle to do. At which point, what am I toggling? Which to do? What it should say is something like mark speak complete or mark speak incomplete, because that's the to do I'm currently focused on. So I need to go fix my app. And this is a very important takeaway. I help a lot of teams improve their automated testing. When I do, what I focus on up front is we have to have the application up as we're writing our tests, because what we tend to find is the app's HTML is bad. In many cases, it uses divs when it should use more semantic markup. It is lacking ARIA labels in places where people need more context. And we make the HTML better, which tends to improve SEO and improve accessibility, and also make our tests easier to write. And then our LLM can come in and put all that to work. So that's the big win here. Now, there is an exception. I said you probably should write automated tests. The book Lean Startup, I read this years ago, and I found it really insightful. And it tells the story of the author going to France, seeing these shirts, and they were French sailor shirts, and he was interested in selling those back in the States. He wondered, okay, maybe I could make a good profit. I've never seen these back in the States. So he comes back to America. He sets up a site. He places some AdWords. People click on those ads. They come in. They try to buy the shirt. And then they see a message that says, we don't have any in stock. They don't have any in stock because he never bought any shirts. He was thinking like a scientist. He's saying, I have a hypothesis. The hypothesis is, if I try to charge people $40 for this shirt and I place ads over here, I'm going to get a conversion rate that justifies my ads over here. And how many people are willing to buy at $40 versus $45 versus $50? So he was just iterating on that. Once he saw he had something, then he buys the shirts and he starts selling. So I say this because he didn't need to write automated tests for what he was doing, because it was just sort of an experiment. And some of us do write code like that. I used to work for Cox Automotive, Auto Trader, Kelley Blue Book. You probably heard of all them. When I worked there, we would sometimes write short-term software. And in that case, I'd go, the tests are probably not worth it. We can just manually test it because it's not very complicated, and the tests aren't really going to be there for very long since we're throwing this away. Again, tests are an investment in the future. We're going to buy us time later. So if we feel like we can do it manually, maybe that makes sense. But it is an exception. It's certainly exceedingly less likely given how fast you can generate tests via an LLM today. Now, Steve asked at the very beginning, are we going to talk about unit tests only? And my answer was no. But the problem is, if I asked all of you in here, what is a unit test? I think I'd get a bunch of different answers. And this has been an ongoing frustration for me, because when I try to talk about unit tests on Twitter, I find we talk past each other because people don't have the same terminology. So I want to share a few terms that I've found useful. There's lots of different types of testing out here, but my take is, let's just focus on these first three. A unit test is testing one thing alone. Thing being one function, one method, one component. That's what I mean by thing. That's my take on a unit test. Now, given this is just my opinion, you guys don't have to agree, but I'm at least going to give you mine, and I would encourage you as a team to agree what that word means. And do not use unit test as a synonym for an automated test. I will hear people do this. They'll say, we need to write more unit tests, and what tool are you using to write those? Playwright. I go, well, why would you be writing unit tests in Playwright? That's a little strange to me, because Playwright is an end-to-end testing tool. It's running in the browser. It's not really intended for testing a single function or a single component. Now, integration tests are testing a few things together. This means a few components, a few functions, maybe a couple classes, but not the whole system. And finally, end-to-end tests are testing everything working together. Of these three, which one actually tells me the darn thing works? End to end. It's the only one. It's the only one. So someone might say, well, we should just write end-to-end tests because a unit test doesn't prove that it works. You guys have probably seen the meme of all unit tests pass and it's the Titanic sinking. But the unit tests pass here and here. Like, hey, you know what? The smokestack still works. The engine's still running. The unit tests are passing, but it's sinking because it's not integrated anymore. The reason that we don't write end-to-end tests all the time is because they're a trade-off. And yeah, there's lots of tools for all these. I don't have time to get into tools, but I'm going to talk about these three. And I want to make sure we all understand what the terminology means, because that's probably the biggest headwind here. This is why we don't just write end-to-end tests. End-to-end tests mean that nothing is mocked out. If you are mocking anything, it is not an end-to-end test. It is an integration test. The moment that I mock out my back end on my SPA, that means it's an integration test. I'm testing the integration of my front-end components, but I'm not testing end-to-end because I'm never hitting the database, I'm never hitting my REST API, those sorts of things. End-to-end tests are slow because it takes so much longer to go all the way to the database than it does, for instance, for me to run a single function that is pure. Given this input, I get this output. That single function I can run in milliseconds. The call all the way to the database and back, in some cases, may take multiple seconds. Just depends how slow our SQL queries are, how slow our database is, how slow our network is, how slow our CI server is. And robustness is the other key to think about here. End-to-end tests tend to be least robust because with an end-to-end test, there is a litany of things that can go wrong and break my test. Maybe my database's data changed. Maybe the data is down. Maybe my network is down. Maybe the environment is down. Maybe somebody broke a little line of code somewhere within my front end or my back end or in my CI server that was deploying the code and so on. Maybe I've got a microservices architecture and one of 14 microservices happens to be down, at which point the end-to-end test fails. And it might not be very easy to figure out that the end-to-end test failed because this certain microservice was flaky for a moment. So end-to-end tests tend to be very frustrating in practice. So if you were to ask me, what I index for, I try to write mostly integration tests. And increasingly, I found this tends to be a fairly popular view, that write tests, mostly integration. That's the way that I think about it. It's kind of like that whole eat food, not too much, mostly vegetables, like simple little rules that will probably get you fairly healthy. So those are the trade-offs here. And I want to emphasize that the risk is there's probably somebody on your team who really likes one of these styles. They might like unit testing because unit testing is easy. If you write a bunch of pure functions, boy, it's pretty simple to set them up. Unit tests are super fast. And once they pass, they tend to pass forever because if I'm testing a pure function, it's always going to pass. Someone else may really like end-to-end because it's the only thing that gives us confidence. So I emphasize the trade-offs here so that you even ask yourself, am I getting too myopically focused on one of these styles and therefore hurting my team? Because I really do need to think about sort of a patchwork of these different styles to truly cover my application. Now, when you talk about a unit test, I define a unit test a lot by what it should not do. It shouldn't call a DB or run a browser or make an HTTP call. A unit test should pass without an internet connection at all. So that's not to say that those things are bad. It's just if it's doing those things, I wouldn't call it a unit test anymore. I'm just curious, how many people agree with my definition of unit test? Good. So the majority of the room at least agrees here. Now, the reason that I've spent a lot of time on verbiage here is I think about it very much as like putting a target on the wall. Until we all agree what the words mean, we're really at risk of talking past one another, especially if somebody on the team is saying, we need to unit test more, and what they actually mean is we need to write more automated tests in general. And you go, wait, I'm confused. We already have quite a few unit tests. I think we need more integration tests. And they're like, well, yeah, same thing. No, it's not the same thing. Let's all agree on terms. These are the sorts of things that are useful to put in some kind of a document for your team. If you've got coding standards, document that in coding standards. Our definition of unit test is. Our definition of integration test is. I'm going to skip past this. So when I look at teams that are struggling, I see a bunch of barriers to testing going on. Sometimes I've come on teams, they had automated tests and they didn't have continuous integration running. And then this really surprising thing happens. I run their test suite and tests fail. Who saw that coming? And I go, well, y'all, if you're not running your tests every time you change your code, they're going to regress over time. And then you're going to find yourself commenting out tests or just ignoring the broken tests. You're not getting value. So this is an obvious one, but it is wild to me seeing teams writing tests and not running them on CI. Very important to set that up. Or maybe they don't have any testing tools installed at all. Sometimes you'll hear people say that they have untestable code. There's no such thing. I do mean it. There is no such thing as untestable code. There is code that is harder to test than others, but if it's truly untestable, what would that even look like? Now, you might have a horribly written application where I can't even figure out how to unit test stuff without mocking out tons of CRUD because it's all so coupled together, but I can still write an end-to-end test for it. If it's a web app, I can go out to the web app and I can write a test for it. Now, that test may be flaky because maybe we're hitting a shared database and the data is changing all the time. There's going to be a lot of things that we'll need to do to make it better, but it's not untestable. It's just different levels of hard that come in here. Now, sometimes there's an issue with team knowledge, or they don't know how to mock, or they don't see examples. So one thing that I really like to do when I join a team, I'll come in and we will create canonical tests. Let's create a few unit tests. Let's create a few integration tests. Let's create a few end-to-end tests. Let's configure all the tools the way we want. Let's set up an instructions file in your LLM so that you guys can generate your tests reliably. And let's start a cadence so that everybody says, all right, I've written a couple tests. I can see the recipes over here. I very much think of myself like a chef. And you could probably imagine this. There's some nice restaurants in this area. And you could walk into one of those restaurants, and when they opened up, some executive chef came in and helped everybody understand how to cook the different dishes. And then that chef can go on vacation because everybody knows how to do these things. As software developers, that's what we're doing all the time. You guys have some senior developer that can help set the recipes, and then everybody else can follow those recipes. So, and this happens all the time in code. You go, okay, I need to go get data from the database. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to look at how we've been fetching data, and I'll do it the same way. I'll use our existing patterns and practices. So when these testing headwinds come up, it's important to resolve them. I would also say, if you think your code isn't testable, well, write tests for new code. I love, this is one of my favorite quotes. Every passing minute is a chance to turn it all around. That's from the movie Vanilla Sky. I love that movie. And I love that quote too because there are times that we screw up. There was a time that I accidentally corrupted a bunch of data in production because I thought I was on a test environment database. I ended up on anti-anxiety meds for a while. I was the only developer too, so I was the only one that could clean it up. I don't recommend being the only developer when you're early in your career. It was a pressure cooker, but I made it through. It did make me better. But I would encourage you, write end-to-end tests for your happy path. If I come onto a team and they have no tests at all, I like to start with this. If it's a web app, I go, well, let's just write some tests that say, I'm going to navigate to each top-level URL and then assert that the heading shows up, which at least says we got a 200 back when we went to every page. We don't know if the whole app works, but geez, at least the thing doesn't blow up when somebody just navigates around it basic. So, and those tests are going to be stable because the headings are unlikely to change. Thank you. And then after you do these basics at the top, you can start adding integration tests, mocking things out, extracting complex logic. And I often like to do that. I would say, okay, I'm in here working with a feature, and I've noticed this complex logic is something that I'd like to use again. I'm going to pull that out to a utility. I'm going to write tests for that reusable utility. And a good example might be a date formatter. We've got complex proprietary logic for formatting dates. Well, let's put that in a pure function. Given this input, I get this output, write a bunch of unit tests that now document all our expected inputs and outputs. And now that utility is really useful for everybody. I can see what it does. I know that it works. It's over here in a spot where people will find it. So if you have headwinds, remove them. So these are the testing headwinds. How do you remove them? These are the sorts of things that I do. Install the testing tools. Run the tests on CI on each pull request, if at all possible. Sometimes you end up in this problem where your test suite takes too long. If it takes too long, see if you can split it across multiple machines, parallelize the processes if at all possible. It is a very last resort to be running your tests at night or once a week. I've worked with teams that do it, but often that's a sign that they have over-indexed on using tools like Cypress and Playwright when they should have leaned a little bit more on using tools like Test or Jest that are faster. Like lean a little more heavily on these faster headless tools when you can. Test new stuff, then slowly test your old stuff. Factor your testing into your estimates. Get training if you feel like you need training. By the way, this is what I do, so you can reach out to me. This ends the commercial. Yeah. Pick a mocking approach. There are a bunch of ways to mock things. I'm a big fan of mock service worker. I absolutely love it. If you have not used mock service worker, go give it a look. It is fantastic. Effectively, what it does is it captures any request from your browser, and then you can decide what's going to be used instead. So I can say, if you go make a post request to user to go write a user record, I'm going to capture that post and instead just use this mock JSON. So now I have all the cards to make my application fast and reliable during tests. Create a few good tests. This is true of anything on your team. Like, create some recipes that everybody can understand, everyone can read, that everyone follows, and the opposite of this is also true. This is a controversial statement, but I'm a believer in creating a folder called Old Stuff Do Not Copy or You Will Be Fired. You could imagine what's in there. Everybody has some of this on your team. Now, you could give it a shorter name like Legacy, but I kind of like the long, dramatic name because then everybody goes, oh, here be dragons. I should not be in here copying and pasting code because this is old. Maybe, for instance, okay, we used to use Hibernate. We've moved off that long ago. We consider it Legacy. We're now over here on Entity Framework. Great. Well, move the legacy code into a spot where everybody sees these big flashing lights. Don't do this anymore. It's legacy. We've got to keep it, but we're moving away from it. And finally, sell your leadership. Make sure that they know the benefits that you're getting from this. This is so important because leadership can get myopically focused on, we've got to hit this state, we've got to hit this state. And as a consultant that comes in and helps people with testing, I've struggled with this too because often I realize the reason people weren't testing is because the executives don't truly support it in their hearts. They'll say, all right, well, what Cory said was really helpful, but also, guys, it doesn't change the fact we got to ship on Friday. And everybody goes, all right, well, I guess we're not doing this before Friday then. We don't have time to learn testing. This is my most controversial section, so buckle up. I've been on teams where I didn't feel supported to do my job the way that I felt I should. I felt so much pressure that I couldn't sleep at night. My boss was throwing things. I was getting yelled at. The business was struggling, and I was literally the only developer. We didn't even have source control at the time. There are going to be times in your career where you've got to make a decision about what you think is right and wrong. And my take is, I don't ask for permission to do my job well. I mean, I pause here to emphasize this because you got hired not just because you can write code, but you got hired for your judgment. Like, all of us in here have professional judgment. And you've got to believe enough in yourself to say, I'm going to do this thing because I think it's right, and I'm not going to ask for permission to write tests. And this seems especially obvious because I'm guessing Has anyone in here ever asked their boss if they could refactor the code that they just wrote before they open a PR? One person in the back did. There have been times that I thought maybe I should, but one thing that I've found in my career, I mean, I've been independent a lot of years now, but back when I actually had a full-time job, I erred on the side of asking for forgiveness rather than permission. And that is generally my career advice to you, that I find most of the time, if you're confident that it's the right thing to do, you're better off to do it if you think that your boss is going to think that they have to say no just because of some policy. So for instance, I'm up here speaking at a conference. I didn't ask my boss if I could start speaking at conferences. I just went. And I didn't share trade secrets. I was careful about that, but I would share what I was learning on the job, and I'd share similar things to what we were doing, because I knew if I asked my boss, he might have to go ask his boss, and somebody way up the chain might say, no, we can't. If you work at Apple, you're not allowed to speak at conferences. I wouldn't want to work at Apple. I have a friend that works there, and they're very, very secretive about things. And if you are speaking anywhere, you have to have your slides approved and all these things. That ain't fun. If you're in a situation where this is untenable, and I've been there, you need to either change your job or change your job. And I love this saying because there have been times when I started speaking at conferences, I had decided, I said, if my boss says I can't speak, then I'm going to need to change my job, which means I either need to sell him on the idea or I need to go find a different job. It was that important to me because I really needed to. I'll share more why this afternoon. I'll share more of the story, but I'm speaking at 1:30 on the immutable laws of software and life, so that's going to be more story-oriented. But I know this is an easy thing to say when the market's good. The market's not great right now, but really, you can always be looking around. You can always be networking. That's why this is so valuable. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about code coverage. Code coverage sounds like this great idea, but it's just not. It's just not at all. The problem is it sounds useful, but it's actually a trap. And the reason that it's a trap is somebody's going to say, oh, I'll test 100% of the code. I've been in interviews, and I'll ask somebody, so what's your take on test coverage? And they'll say, oh, I always do 100% test coverage. And I go, you're a liar. I don't believe you. I think you're telling me what you think I want to hear. But it makes me question whether you're being honest with me. The thing is, if you want 100% test coverage, I can make the tool say 100%. There are ways to make a test coverage tool happy. All it is saying is you have executed all these lines. It doesn't mean that I actually have good tests. It just means that I've executed a bunch of code. And this is a common misnomer where people don't realize how poor code coverage tools actually are. I'm not saying that code coverage tools are worthless. I'm saying they are worth less than you probably think. If you tell me that your code coverage tool says that you have 0% code coverage, I'd say, okay, well that tells me a lot actually. That's helpful. But if you tell me that your code coverage tool says that you have 100% test coverage, that tells me you're probably trying to make the tool say 100% and wasting a bunch of time as a result. Whereas if you tell me you have, say, 70 or 80%, I go, okay, you're probably a mature-ish team and you have pragmatically decided what in here is good enough. There's an old Dilbert cartoon related to this where people were getting bonuses for writing fixes for bugs. And be very careful about the incentives that you create. If you incentivize everybody to try to hit 100% test coverage, they'll get it, but you might not actually get the result that you're looking for. There's a related law here. I'm going to talk about this more this afternoon. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. You could probably think of other examples of this. Have anybody ever worked on a team where you were estimating in story points, and then later people go, hey, that team over there is doing 50 story points. Your team's only doing 25. You go, yeah, but they define story points differently than we do. There's no universal standard for a story point. What are we doing here? Now that it's become a target, now I'm freaked out. Oh, I didn't know that you were monitoring how many pull requests I end up opening. Well, I'm just going to open up 1,000 tiny pull requests then, and I'll be the best on the team. I'll just, one line of code change, here's my PR. That's why people will game these sorts of things. So the solution isn't code coverage, it's code reviews. You really do need people looking at your tests. The other solution is, although I don't have a slide for it, is using a tool that will actually mutate the code. Mutation testing. Striker is an example of this. You can use Striker with JavaScript, with C# and others. It will literally go in and change your code, and then if a test doesn't fail, you know that you're missing a test. Like a really cool idea. We also have to be careful about under-engineering versus over-engineering. I have worked with people who have made mistakes on both sides, and I myself have definitely made these mistakes on both sides. Early in my career, I definitely was an under-engineer because I didn't really even know what I was doing. As I sort of hit that peak in the middle, then I found myself probably over-engineering, and now I would like to think after 20 some odd years, I've found a happy medium in here. Like you figure out when you've gone too far and when you probably haven't gone far enough. This is what I was talking about, Striker. If you truly want to know if you have 100% test coverage, put this on your code, and it's going to literally change conditionals from true to false, change numbers, change strings, and if tests don't start failing, well, you're missing a test. Okay, we got like 5 minutes left, so I'm going to breeze past mocking, although I do want to draw your attention to Mock Service Worker, which I talked before. It is fantastic. It's free, open source. Check it out. And I'm also a big fan of creating custom dev tools. This is such a powerful feature. To give you a sense of how powerful this is, I believe that you should create dev tools for your app. And this is sort of a picture of what I'm talking about. Imagine that you had a div that just pops up on the side only when you're doing local development, and you can control turning feature flags on and off. You can control what user you're logged in as. You can control the response from every RESTful endpoint. You can change the mocks. You can change how fast each request comes in. I have worked on teams with this pattern, and we fly. Trust me, it takes a little bit of work to set this up. This uses Mock Service Worker behind the scenes, but once you get this going, now you hold all the cards. So I did work a few years ago for Discover Card. They were moving over to React, and I'm in Kansas City. They're in Chicago. They said, the only way that you can work with us using our APIs is to fly to Chicago and use our IBM laptops in our office. And I go, well, that's not great because I don't want to be in your office for months. I want to stay in Kansas City. So what they did was they sent me their API documentation, and I wrote the entire front end without ever hitting a real endpoint. I just mocked it all out. I handed it to them, and here's the wild thing. It almost completely worked. There were a couple of endpoints that immediately failed, and they failed because their documentation was out of date. So we fixed that. I gave it back to them, and they said, yeah, it's good to go. It was amazing. And so I'm on planes, I'm at conferences, I'm in a Faraday cage like this. Like, it doesn't, like, I can be anywhere and code because I don't need internet. I also have this rule, no manual clicks during dev. Try to get the testing tool to do it for you. So I write the test first. Do test-driven development on UI. Have playwright, click, drag, enter fields, assert. And that way, I only have to write that code once. And again, with LLMs doing this so well, I can tell the LLM to write these tests, and it tends to really accelerate things. But I shouldn't be manually filling out a form 14 times to make sure it works. Write the test once, and then every time I hit save, I'm watching those tests pass. All right, I'm going to breeze past all this because this is actually intended to be much more than an hour-long talk, but we're going to get to, oh, I'd like to talk about that. Yeah, lots of good stuff here. See, now you get a sense of how much more. All right, a couple things. Let's talk about the key points. Fix your headwinds. I bet you almost everybody in here has a headwind that I mentioned before. Maybe you don't have good canonical tests. Maybe you disagree on terminology. Maybe you feel like you don't have permission. Maybe your team doesn't quite understand the differences between these different test types. Or this, maybe you haven't made tests part of your definition of done. If your team lacks a definition of done, that's step one. Set a bar today, and maybe that bar will not include tests. Okay, fine, but at least say, this is what we expect. Maybe manual testing, or maybe definition of done is at least you pair programmed with somebody for a moment so that they could review it. And consider creating custom dev tools as well. For more on this, long ago, this is a very old book by Roy Osherove that I found useful just about unit testing. A lot of what I've learned about unit testing, I was informed by from the testing library docs, which are wonderful. Those are helpful. So those are two that I found pretty useful. If you want the slides, Unfortunately, I have not updated this. This is a link to slides, but it's an older version of these slides that lacks the AI stuff that I put in this morning. So if you go out to Twitter, I'll tweet out the latest version of these slides in a moment, but this will get you most of what I've talked about today. I'm holding for the cameras. This is the paparazzi moment. Yes. Okay. And 3, 2, 1. Y'all need faster phones. I don't know. All right. Also, so I author courses at pluralsight.com. I also just started publishing on DomeTrain. I've got a TypeScript course out there. Most of my stuff on Pluralsight is React and automated testing and a little bit of C# as well. So I am primarily a front-end consultant. You can find me at reactjsconsulting.com. I know that says React, but as you can see, I'm big into automated testing, and I'm also increasingly into LLMs and AI and helping teams bring sort of all of this together. You can find me on Twitter at HouseCore. Yeah, I'm still calling it Twitter. I like it. That's a better name. Was this useful? You guys feel like you learned something? Awesome. Thank you.